favorite book. So the story we're going to look at today is called Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day.
Except mine is all gray.
How cool. All right, let's listen here. Okay? When I went to sleep with gum in my mouth, and now there's gum in my hair. And when I got out of bed this morning, I tripped on the skateboard, and by mistake, I dropped my sweater in the sink while the water was running. And I could tell it was going to be a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. In the carpool, Miss Gibson let Becky have a seat by the window. Audrey and Elliot got seats by the window too. I said I was being scrunched. I said I was being smushed. I said, if you don't get me a seat by the window, I'm going to be carsick. No one even answered. I could tell it was going to be a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. There were 2 cupcakes in Philip Parker's lunch bag, and Albert got a Hershey bar with almonds, and Paul's mother gave him a piece of jelly roll that had little coconut sprinkles on the top. Guess whose mother forgot to put in dessert? It was a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. When we picked up my dad from his office, he said I couldn't play with his copying machine, but I forgot. He also said, watch out for the books on his desk. And I was careful as could be, except for my elbow. He also said, don't fool around with his phone. But I think I called Australia. My dad said, please don't pick him up anymore. It was a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. My bath was too hot. I got soap in my eyes. My marble went down the drain, and I had to wear my railroad train pajamas. I hate my railroad train pajamas. When I went to bed, Nick took back the pillow he said I could keep, and the Mickey Mouse nightlight burned out, and I bit my tongue. The cat wants to sleep with Anthony, not me. It's been a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. My mom says some days are like that. All right, so Alexander had a bad day, didn't he? Raise your hand if you've ever had a bad day before.
I haven't.
Oh, I'm so glad. I've had a few. So what I noticed as Alexander was talking is that he was feeling lots of things. So when he got gum in his hair, he was feeling disgusted. I think I would too. And then when he was in the car and his friends were ignoring him, I think he felt kind of sad. And then
He said he would get carsick.
That's so true. He'd get carsick. That would make me sad. And probably his mommy and daddy too. Yes. And then his mom forgot dessert in his lunchbox. And I think that made him feel angry. And probably jealous too. So many feelings. So what we're going to talk about a little bit today is that we're going to talk about feelings. And guess what? In the Bible, we learn that having feelings is okay. It says in the Bible that we are created in God's image. And so do you know what that means? That God has feelings just like we do. That it's okay to feel happy and disgusted and let's see what else, and loved, and that it's even okay to feel angry. But the Bible goes on and tells us something else so very important about these feelings. That feelings are okay, but what we do with our feelings is where we can sometimes get into some trouble. So anger is okay, but what we don't want to do is when we're feeling angry is to be unkind to people or hurt others. So this week, I want you to feel all your feelings, okay? And a good way to feel your feelings is to share them with other people. Share them with your mom and your dad or other people that you love. And then I want you to remember that it is okay if you're angry, but it's not okay to hurt someone. Can you all do that this week?
God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing in your sight. Amen. Poor Alexander, man, he had a rough day. I love from the minute that book opens and you hear that he went to bed with gum in his hair and then woke up with gum in his hair, you know he's the third child, right? He obviously has two older brothers. Who lets their first child go to bed with gum in their mouth, okay? But the third child, you're like, good luck. But then he doesn't get a seat by the window in carpool, and he has to go to the dentist after school, and his mom forgets lunch, and his friends rebuff him on the playground, and his dad's mad because he called Australia, and then his Mickey Mouse nightlight breaks, and he's had a rough day. And Alexander is angry, right? And I mean, if all of those things happened to me in one single day, I would be pretty angry too. At one point in the story, Lori read an abridged version, but there's one point in the story that he says, I'm having a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day, and I've told everyone, and no one answered me. And I think that might be like what upsets him the most. This idea that he is having this awful day and no one else even seems to care that it's as bad as it is. And so he experiences anger. By the end of the book, he's just mad. He's mad at his day. He's mad at all the things that happen. He's mad that he lives in America instead of Australia. At the very end of the book, it says his mom told him some days are like that. And then if you turn the page, it says even in Australia, right? Like it's bad everywhere. And Alexander's just mad about it. And he feels anger. And we can relate to that. We know what it's like to sort of have those days and just feel anger, just feel like nothing goes right or every little thing sets us off. And we experience that emotion of anger. Anger at its core is what happens when we feel like something is not as it should be or not as we expect or not right. It might objectively be not right. It might be an injustice that is objectively not right. It might be, in our opinion only, something is not right. But if we perceive in any way that something is not as it should be, then we have this emotion of anger that wells up in us. Brene Brown wrote a book recently called Atlas of the Heart that is an absolute treasure, and I commend it to you all. And in it, she kind of goes into a number, maybe 50 or so, different emotions and really defines them in a way that's more meaningful than how we normally nuance our emotions, right? She makes this point that most of us feel happy, sad, and mad. Those are sort of the main things that we could categorize our emotions as. But she said, actually, there's just so much more nuance to it. And so she defines each of these emotions so we can better identify them and react to them. And here's what she says about anger. She said, when we feel anger, we believe that someone or something else is to blame for an unfair or unjust situation, and, this is important, and that something can be done to resolve the problem. Right? We feel despair if we're angry about something that is unjust or happened and nothing can be done about it. But she said, anger is an action emotion. We want to do something when we feel it and when we're on the receiving end of it. We expect that there is something further than just feeling our anger, but that it provokes us to something else. But as Christians, as Christ followers, we're taught that it's not okay to be angry. So many of us grew up with this sense that you are just supposed to sing Kumbaya, and you are supposed to be peace-loving, and you are supposed to suppress your anger, and you're not going to feel anger because we are Christians, and we don't get angry. And Christians are just peaceful and happy all of the time. But we know that suppressing our anger doesn't actually work. There was an interesting clinical study that looked at what happens when we suppress negative feelings or emotions rather than actually just try to live into them and feel them. And it had everybody put their hand in like ice cold water. And they told half the group beforehand, when you put your hand in this ice cold water, try to ignore how badly it hurts. And they told the other half of the group, when you put your hand in this ice cold water, just acknowledge the pain and live in the pain and lean into the pain and think about the pain, like understand the pain and try and analyze the pain. And they found that the people who put their hand in there and tried to ignore the pain didn't last even half as long as the people who just acknowledged the pain and recognized the pain and lived into it. And our emotions are that way too, anger especially. When we try to suppress it and we ignore it, it ends up blowing up, and usually at the most inopportune times. But when we recognize that we have anger or other negative emotions and we try to figure out how to deal with them, we're better able to do so, and it's healthier. There's actually an article in the New York Times in like April or March of this year that is one of the reasons that I really wanted to preach this sermon. When I read it, I was like, there is something there that we need to talk about. And the article studied folks, the psychologist that ran the study was in University of California system somewhere, I think UCSF. And she studied how folks judge their own negative feelings. So if you have feelings of like anger primarily is what she was studying, but disappointment and shame and all these other things, and you negatively judge yourself for having them, you are so much more likely to have depression and anxiety and all of these other like factors that go with it. But if you neutrally judge these feelings, if you're like, I have anger. Okay, this is a thing I have. We need to deal with it, but I have it. And you don't judge yourself or shame yourself for having it, then you're so much healthier. And so I think as Christians, because we kind of have this sense that we're supposed to not have anger and never deal with it and just, again, be the peace-loving kumbaya people, we aren't taught to healthily channel our anger, to manage it with God, in relationship with God, and in relationship with the people around us. But here's the deal. Anger is both an emotional and a biochemical reaction, right? You can no more prevent your amygdala, which is like the center, the part of your brain in the back of your brain that controls your emotions. You can no more prevent it from sending out an alarm whenever you have feelings of anger than you could do anything else, right? So when you have these feelings of anger, all of the sudden what happens is quicker than your prefrontal cortex, which has our judgment in it, which tells us like, don't freak out about this or don't get overly angry about this. Quicker than the signal gets to your prefrontal cortex, everything else in your body that is going to happen as a result of the anger starts happening. Your heart rate increases and your blood pressure increases and your breathing rate increases, and actually blood flows to your extremities. This is like a natural primitive response. Blood would flow to your extremities to prepare your extremities for some type of physical action. And that happens so quickly, right? You have these, the catecholamines, which are released, the hormone that's released from your amygdala, just sends your whole body into this immediate state of heightened awareness that you have to deal with your anger. And then it comes to your prefrontal cortex and you're like, oh, okay, we're going to rein that in. We're going to figure it out. But all of that happens really quickly. And so because it's a biochemical reaction, we can't just assume that we can decide not to be angry and we will never feel anger again. In the book, Alexander has a truly awful, awful day. And he thinks, this wouldn't be happening if I lived in Australia. And his mom reminds him, it happens everywhere, because that is the truth of our human condition. Like sometimes we're just going to get angry. Things are going to happen around us and to us and in front of us. And it's going to set us off. So is anger okay? Thank you for that, Mary Holland. She and I have been talking about this week. It is okay to have anger. It's just what you do with it that matters, right? It's what Miss Lori said. The way that we manage our anger, the result of our anger is what determines whether or not we are still in line with what God wants for us. Think about it this way. If you lost your house in a fire, you would think fire is bad. But we have so many things that we use fire for that are good. Fires can destroy an entire forest, but they can help us cook a meal, right? Fires can do terrible things, but they can refine as well. A fire that is out of control is destructive. Just like anger that is out of control, that we don't have our finger on the pulse of, is destructive. But there are so many ways in which fire in a controlled way is good and necessary for us. And so anger in a controlled way is good and necessary for us to process what's happening around us. But we have to make sure that it doesn't destroy relationships and cause us to flare up at people and become a barrier between ourselves and God. And so instead of running from it, we figure out how to control it. And we look to God. We look to this lens of Jesus and of God and the way in which God felt anger. And we see this demonstrated in Jesus' life to understand it for ourselves. So all throughout the New Testament, it says God is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. Slow to anger. But we see that God's angry, right? The prophets tell us over and over again that God is angered with the way that people are treated. God is angered with the way that things are in the world, but God doesn't immediately rush to anger. There's this really interesting pericope in Mark when Jesus enters Jerusalem for the Palm Sunday festival. And it's only in Mark that it says he enters Jerusalem. It says he went into the temple, and when he had looked around at everything, then he went to Bethany for the night. He looked around at everything. He saw the money changing that was happening. He saw the abuses of power. He saw that things weren't the way they were supposed to be. And once he'd seen it, he left and he went to Bethany for the night. And then we know the next day he went back and he turned the tables over and he demonstrated his anger. But he didn't react immediately. He was calculated and understood really how to be slow to anger. And that's a picture for us as well, not to just react on the fly. And Jesus' anger was about justice. It was about righteousness. God's anger is impelled by love, right? True love, in the perfect sense of the word, will always be angered by betrayal and by mistreatment and by oppression. God will always be angered by those things. The Henry Ward Beecher was a really famous pastor in the 19th century because he was an abolitionist and he traveled and spoke a lot on that. And he said, "A man that does not know how to be angry does not know how to be good. Now and then, a man should be shaken to the core with indignation over all things evil." He was talking about slavery, but that's a reminder of how God is angered and how we should be angered as well. But the majority of the time, we're angry because we've turned inward, right? We are angry for selfish reasons, like the coach didn't put our kid in as often as we think the coach should have put our kid in, or airline tickets are getting really expensive, or there's no bananas at the grocery store when we go, or we get passed over for a promotion. We're angered because the umpires are making bad calls against the Astros. We have all kinds of reasons that we are angered, but most of those reasons are selfish. Now look, you'll notice that in Paul's text that we're going to read today, I'm going to read you two versions. He's careful not to say, "Do not sin by being angry." Rather, he says, "In your anger, do not sin." Look, here's the first version from the NLT. "Don't sin by letting anger control you. Don't let the sun go down while you're still angry." And then the second, he says, this is from the Message, "Go ahead and be angry. You do well to be angry, but don't use your anger as fuel for revenge, and don't stay angry." So the issue is not actually the getting angry, it's what happens with our anger. Because here's the thing, anger's natural end, if you don't do anything about it, anger's natural end is sin. It is always going to lead us to sin. James says in the epistle that James wrote, human anger does not have God's righteousness to it, right? We are never going to be angry the way that God does. In Ecclesiastes, Solomon says this, "Don't be quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the hearts of fools." It gets stuck in our hearts, and then it makes us into different people when we get angry and we hold on to that anger. When Cain presents his offering to God and it's not as highly received as Abel's offering, Cain gets really angry. And God says to him, "Cain, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." So how do we rule over the sin that comes from anger? How do we rule over our anger so it doesn't turn into sin? Well, we can look at Job, for example. For those of you who are not as familiar with Job, he was a guy that lived probably during the time of the patriarchs, like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And there's a book of the Bible that is about Job's life. And Job was a righteous guy. He did everything right. And the whole first chapter of the book just talks about how righteous he is. And so then we see that Job ends up through a series of events losing all of his herd, his livestock, all of his animals. He loses all of his property and his land. He loses all of his children. And Job, instead of responding by cursing God, the text says, Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and fell on the ground. And he said to God, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I return there. The Lord giveth, and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And then eventually his health gets worse, and his wife and his friends all start cursing God and shaking their fists at God on his behalf. But Job refuses to, because the scripture says Job did not sin with his lips. In all of this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrongdoing. The nearer that Job was able to draw to God, the less likely he was to commit the sin that comes from anger. Sure, he was fired up about losing all of this. He was sad about it. He was hurt about it. But he didn't sin against God. He didn't sin against God with his lips by crying out. He did no wrongdoing as a result of what was boiling inside of him. And the nearer that we draw to God, the more likely we are going to be able to pull ourselves away from that natural end of anger that results in sin. In the book, one of the things that happens was Alexander gets ignored by his friends on the playground, and he says, I hope they go sit on a tack. Wonder how often in our anger we are more like Job or we are more like Alexander. I know that personally I tend to want to deal with my anger via vindication, right? Frederick Buechner, who was a great pastor, Presbyterian pastor of the 20th century, and a prolific writer, he wrote this. He said, of the 7 deadly sins, anger is possibly the most fun. Do you relate to that? He says you get to lick your wounds and smack your lips over grievances long past, and you get to roll your tongue over the prospect of bitter confrontations still to come. You get to savor the last toothsome morsel, both the pain you are given and the pain that you are giving back. And in many ways, anger is a feast fit for a king. The chief drawback is that what you are wolfing down as yourself. The skeleton at the feast is you. Holding on to our anger, letting it turn into this natural end of sin, is like when we drink poison and hope that the person that we're angry at is the one that dies from us drinking the poison. There's this great Native American proverb about the grandfather who's talking to his grandson, and he's telling him there is a battle within you and there's a battle within all of us. And it's a battle of 2 wolves. And one of the wolves is the wolf of love and of peace and of joy and of kindness and generosity and forgiveness. And one of the wolves is of anger and of frustration and of cruelty and of lying and of greed. And those wolves are always fighting in your heart. And the grandson says, so which wolf wins? And the grandfather says, the one you feed. It is so tempting for us to do what Frederick Buechner says, which is to sit at that feast of anger and to lick our lips over what is to come, of the bitter confrontation, of the hoping for hurt, of the sitting on attack, of wanting somebody else to suffer. But Paul tells us, don't let that anger shape you. Don't let that anger sit so long in your heart that it makes you bitter, that it makes you into somebody that God doesn't want you to be. Let that anger be a catalyst for change, for reconciliation, for making something different. Let it be a catalyst for your relationships. Let it be a catalyst for yourself, for the situations that you find yourself in. Look, we generally respond in anger because we know that there is something off kilter. Whether it's off kilter in us, it's like a check engine light that's a signal flag that says there is something off with you and you're not quite right and you need to fix it, or there's something off kilter in the world around you, that there's some injustice or some pain or something you see, some system, whether you're a part of it or you just witness it, that needs to be fixed. But we should care when we see that, when that check engine light comes on, so much about reconciliation that we are prone to move towards fixing it. That this is a catalyst for us to actually change. I love and I live by that saying that you can't prevent a bird from landing over on your head, but you can prevent it from building a nest there. Anytime some emotion or feeling visits me and it threatens to overtake me, and sometimes I will be frank with you, you can ask Whitney, he is not here today, but you could ask him. It is true, sometimes the emotions do actually overtake me. But I really try to remember, it is my opportunity to either let it build a nest there or not. When Whitney and I started dating, my father-in-law had on their refrigerator some kind of proverbs and sayings and articles that he really liked, and they've been gone for like 20 years now, but one of them that stood out to me that I love said, attitude is everything. Life is 10% what happens to you and 90% how you respond to it. And so you get to respond. You get to choose how you're going to respond to your anger. You can bury it deep in your heart. You can do what Solomon warns against in Ecclesiastes and just lodge it there and then sit on it and feed on it and let it shape you and let it turn you into a bitter person that's consumed by malice, the hope for evil, by wrongdoing, or you can work to get it out. We can take steps to deal with our anger. So look, in this text again, Paul says, do not let the sun go down while you are still angry. He recognizes that anger is something that we can become obsessive about and we can want to feed. And he says, don't let it linger in your heart. Now, he talks about not letting the sun go down. Don't let the sun set on your anger. That's because the sunset was really the end of the day in Paul's time. For businesses, they just stopped doing business whenever the sun set. And that was when they ended their day. And so what Paul's saying is, if you have the business of anger in your heart, if you're carrying around, if you have started doing the business of anger and harboring it, make it your business to finish it off, to treat it like something you would do every single day in your job and clean it up. Paul's not as concerned if sunset is at 8 p.m. and you don't deal with something until 10 p.m. or deal with it until the next day. I mean, this isn't a legalistic thing. This is just this idea. And let me say this. There are angers and there are hurts and there are things that that I can understand and we have all experienced being angry about that can't be dealt with in a day, that shouldn't be dealt with immediately in a day, immediately put behind us. What Paul's telling us to do is move toward reconciliation. Make it our business to move toward reconciliation. And so this isn't about one calendar day. This might be, and I want to commend you, if you are doing work to move toward reconciliation on something hard that you're angry about, I want to commend and encourage you if it is one calendar year or one calendar decade. But if you are taking steps and moving toward the reconciliation of that anger. If you're not, you're drinking poison and you're hoping that somebody else suffers, but you're going to be the one that suffers. The world tells us when you're angry, you deserve to get even, right? The world will issue you a blank check. Think of how many times you have had some situation that you're really righteously angry about, and you call a friend because what you want out of it and what you think you're going to get when you call that friend is someone to be like, yeah, you're right. You know, you should totally get even, or you should do this, or you should do that, because that is what the world tells us that we should do and what we crave. Let me offer you this. God also tells you that you need to give the people that made you angry exactly what they deserve. God wants you to give them exactly what they deserve. But what God says they deserve, and what God says you deserve, and what I deserve is love and grace and forgiveness and kindness. And so what God is saying is, yes, there are things in the world that are going to make you angry, and they should be a catalyst for change. Maybe they catalyze you to change some system or change your behavior or change your relationship. But our response isn't just to lodge them in our hearts and to sit on them and let them provoke us to malice, provoke us to evil, provoke us to bitterness. What God says is that when that lodges in your heart, you move toward God and you let it provoke you to God's love, to God's grace, to God's forgiveness, to the things that we're probably incapable of on our own, but that when God fills us with them, we are able to give them to other people. So with our anger, we give people exactly what they deserve and exactly what we deserve: God's love.